the oracle bones. In 1899, in the rural outskirts of Anyang and Henan province, a scholar named Wang Yirong examined a batch of so-called dragon bones sold in a traditional medicine shop. The bones were being ground into powder as a remedy for malaria. But as Wang looked closer, he noticed something impossible to ignore. Etched into the surface of several ox scapulae and turtle plastrons were rows of symbols, not decorative scratches, not random marks. These were structured characters. What he was holding was not medicine. It was a message, and it had been buried for over 3,000 years. Excavations soon followed at what would later be identified as the last capital of the Shang dynasty. Archaeologists uncovered pits filled with thousands of inscribed bones, many cracked from exposure to intense heat. Each specimen followed a precise ritual format. A question was carved into the bone, often including the date and the name of the diviner. The bone was then heated with a metal rod until it fractured. The cracks were interpreted as a response from ancestral spirits or deities. In many cases, the outcome of the event was later carved beside the original question. The questions were not vague or symbolic. They were specific and practical. Would it rain within 10 days? Should the king launch a military campaign? Would a royal consort survive childbirth? The inscriptions recorded not only the inquiry, but sometimes the actual outcome, allowing modern researchers to compare prediction with result. In several instances, the events described in the after record aligned with known archaeological evidence, including war campaigns and harvest cycles. Physically, the bones revealed deliberate preparation. The surfaces were shaved flat. Hollows were drilled in measured positions to control where cracks would form. The heat was applied in a consistent pattern, creating predictable fracture lines. This was not random superstition. It was a controlled ritual system, refined over generations. By the early 20th century, over 100,000 oracle bone fragments had been recovered. They now represent the earliest known form of Chinese writing. Yet their purpose was not administrative, it was communicative. Each bone functioned as a medium between the living and something unseen. When the first discoveries were announced, many scholars dismissed the spiritual component as primitive belief. The bones were reclassified as historical documents rather than ritual devices. Photographs of early excavations disappeared during political upheavals. Entire collections were scattered across private holdings. Some fragments were lost forever. What remains is a silent archive of questions asked to something beyond direct human perception. If these bones were merely tools for psychological reassurance, why was such precision required? Why record outcomes beside predictions? Why refine the cracking process with such technical care? The Shang rulers believed they were not speaking into emptiness. They believed they were receiving answers. If thousands of bones, spanning centuries, were used as structured communication devices, then the unsettling question is not whether the spirits responded. The unsettling question is whether the system produced consistent results for reasons we still do not fully understand. The Omphalos Stone. In the 6th century BCE, high in the mountains of central Greece, pilgrims climbed narrow stone paths toward the sanctuary of Delphi. Kings, generals, and lawmakers traveled hundreds of miles to stand before a single object, resting within the temple of Apollo. That object was not a throne, nor a weapon, nor a statue of gold. It was a carved stone roughly 3 feet high, rounded at the top, wrapped in a sculpted net pattern. The Greeks called it the Omphalos, the navel of the world, and according to their belief, it marked the exact point where communication between humans and gods was strongest. The stone stood near a chasm in the earth. Ancient accounts describe vapors rising from below, faint and sweet-smelling. Above this fissure sat the Pythia, the oracle of Delphi. When consultations began, she would descend into an inner chamber, seat herself near the Omphalos, and enter a trance. What followed were utterances that shaped the course of empires. Croesus of Lydia was advised here before attacking Persia. Spartan leaders sought guidance before war. Even Alexander the Great stood before this stone, demanding prophecy. Modern geological surveys conducted in the 20th century revealed that Delphi lies at the intersection of 2 fault lines. Beneath the temple runs a bituminous limestone layer capable of releasing ethylene gas under seismic pressure. Laboratory studies show that low concentrations of ethylene can induce altered states of consciousness, including euphoria and dissociation, without rendering a subject unconscious. The physical conditions described in ancient texts are consistent with this phenomenon. The omphalos itself was not randomly placed. It marked a specific location directly above the suspected vent. The stone weighs approximately 1,300 pounds and was carved with deliberate symmetry. Though often treated as symbolic, it functioned as a fixed reference point inside the chamber. The Pythia's position relative to the stone and the vent appears to have been carefully controlled. When excavations began in the 19th century, French archaeologists uncovered fragments of the original omphalos. The stone was removed, catalogued, and displayed in a museum setting. The chasm was sealed. Official reports minimized the descriptions of gas emissions found in ancient sources. Later reconstructions of the temple omitted discussion of environmental factors. The oracles delivered at Delphi were famously ambiguous, yet their authority was absolute. Entire political systems deferred to responses generated within that chamber. If those responses were influenced by geological conditions interacting with human neurology, then the stone was more than sacred decoration. It was a component in a physical interface between environment and mind. No modern institution acknowledges Delphi as anything beyond a religious site. Yet seismic monitoring in the region continues under restricted parameters. The exact vent beneath the temple remains partially inaccessible. If a precisely positioned stone above a geological fault could alter consciousness in a predictable way, then the boundary between divine revelation and environmental technology begins to blur. The omphalos may have marked more than the center of the world. It may have marked a place where human perception was deliberately modified. And if that is true, what exactly were those ancient visitors hearing when they knelt before the stone? The Urim and Thummim. In the late 2nd millennium BCE, within the inner chamber of the Israelite tabernacle, a high priest stood before a breastplate set with 12 gemstones. Hidden within that sacred garment were two objects referred to only as the Urim and the Thummim. Their exact shape was never fully described. No surviving specimen has ever been recovered. Yet, according to multiple passages in the Hebrew Scriptures, these stones were used to determine the will of God in matters of war, leadership, and national survival. Decisions that would cost thousands of lives were resolved through their use. The earliest references describe moments of crisis. When King Saul sought guidance before battle, he inquired through the Urim. When tribal disputes threatened unity, the stones were consulted. The process appears structured. A question was posed, an answer was received. The text suggests binary outcomes, possibly affirmative or negative, though the method of extraction remains unclear. Some scholars theorize that the stones were marked in a way that allowed casting like lots. Others argue they may have been luminous minerals that glowed under certain conditions. The breastplate that held them, known as the hoshin, was worn directly over the heart of the high priest. The Urim and Thummim were placed inside a pouch behind the gemstones. This placement suggests concealment, not display. Their operation was restricted to a single authorized individual. Unlike idols or public ritual objects, these stones functioned within a tightly controlled environment. No archaeological record confirms their material composition. The Second Temple period texts imply they ceased functioning at some point in history. Later, rabbinic writings refer to them as sacred relics of a vanished era. When the First Temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, the Ark of the Covenant disappeared. If the Urim and Thummim were stored with it, they vanished as well. What makes these stones unsettling is not their mystery alone, but their political weight. Entire military campaigns were launched or halted based on their verdict. Unlike prophetic trance states, this was not an ambiguous utterance. It was presented as a clear answer delivered through an object. After the Babylonian exile, references to the stones become sparse. The decision-making structure shifted toward written law and human deliberation. The objects were never replaced. There is no recorded attempt to replicate them. Modern historians often reduce the Urim and Thummim to ritual casting tools, equivalent to sacred dice. Yet the texts insist on something more direct. They describe inquiry and response, not probability. The loss of the stones is treated not as a logistical inconvenience, but as the end of a channel. If two physical objects were believed to serve as a conduit between a nation and its divine authority, their disappearance is more than symbolic. It represents a severed connection. the question remains unresolved. Were these stones merely instruments of psychological reassurance, or were they part of a structured decision mechanism whose principles have been forgotten? And if such a mechanism once existed at the center of political power, why did no civilization attempt to recreate it once it was gone? The Obsidian Mirror of Dee. In 1582, inside a dimly lit chamber in Mortlake, England, a scholar sat before a polished black surface no larger than a dinner plate. The scholar was Dr. John Dee, mathematician, astronomer, advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. The object resting on the table was not European in origin. It was a disc of obsidian, approximately 7 inches across, cut and polished to a reflective sheen. It had been brought to Europe decades earlier from Mexico, likely seized during Spanish expeditions. To Dee, it was not a curiosity. It was a device. Together with an associate named Edward Kelly, Dee conducted a series of sessions in which Kelly would gaze into the mirror for extended periods. The goal was not meditation, it was communication. Detailed journals survive, recording dates, times, planetary alignments, and transcripts of what Kelly claimed to see and hear. The voices identified themselves as angelic intelligences. They dictated a structured language now known as Enochian, complete with grammar, syntax, and vocabulary. The mirror itself was simple in form, a convex slab of volcanic glass, nearly opaque, absorbing light rather than reflecting it sharply. Obsidian has unique optical properties. Its dark surface allows prolonged visual fixation without visual noise. Under candlelight, it produces depth rather than reflection, encouraging dissociation in the observer. Modern psychological studies suggest that scrying surfaces can induce mild hallucinations after sustained gazing, particularly in low-light environments. What unsettles historians is not that Kelly reported visions, it is the complexity of what followed. The Enochian language, as recorded in Dee's journals, was not random syllables. It formed a coherent linguistic system. Some linguists argue it resembles constructed languages. Others note that neither Dee nor Kelly had known training in linguistic invention. The mirror remains preserved today in the British Museum. It measures roughly 7.5 inches in diameter and weighs just under 2 pounds. It shows no inscriptions, no mechanical components, no hidden chambers. It is simply a black, reflective disc. After Dee's death, his reputation deteriorated. He was labeled a mystic, then a charlatan. Portions of his journals disappeared for centuries before resurfacing in fragmented collections. Some transcripts were never fully published. References to certain sessions are missing pages. In political context, Dee was more than a mystic. He was involved in early intelligence work for the English crown. His correspondence included coded symbols marking letters as intended for secret service. Some historians speculate that the sessions were either elaborate deceptions or psychological experiments. Others maintain that Dee genuinely believed he was contacting something beyond the human realm. If the mirror was merely a psychological trigger, then it demonstrates how material objects can alter cognition in measurable ways. But if the structured language recorded in those sessions originated outside Dee's conscious invention, then the mirror was more than glass. The unsettling fact is that the object still exists. It has been tested, weighed, cataloged. It reveals no anomaly. Yet the transcripts associated with it describe dialogues spanning years. Was the mirror a tool that opened the subconscious mind, or did it function as something Dee himself believed it to be? A window? And if a simple disk of volcanic glass could serve as an interface between perception and something perceived as external, how many other relics once operated under similar principles? The Aztec smoking mirror. In 1519, as Spanish forces advanced through central Mexico, they encountered priests carrying polished black mirrors mounted in wooden frames. These objects were not decorative ornaments. They were ritual instruments dedicated to Tezcatlipoca, a deity whose name translates as smoking mirror. According to Aztec cosmology, Tezcatlipoca could see all actions of humankind through his mirror, observing events across realms of existence. The physical mirrors recovered from temples were made of obsidian, a volcanic glass formed from rapidly cooled lava. Each disc measured between 6 and 10 inches in diameter and was polished to a near flawless surface. Unlike reflective metal mirrors common in Europe at the time, obsidian absorbs most visible light. When viewed under dim illumination, its surface does not produce a clear image, but a deep, shifting darkness. Ritual accounts describe priests gazing into these mirrors for extended periods, sometimes while fasting or inhaling incense smoke derived from copal resin. The environment inside Aztec ceremonial chambers was controlled: low light, rhythmic chanting, controlled breathing. The mirror was positioned at eye level, sometimes mounted to allow steady fixation. Archaeological analysis confirms that these mirrors were carefully shaped using abrasion techniques that required hours of grinding with sand and water. The edges were symmetrical. Some were inlaid with turquoise or framed in wood. Their placement within temple complexes suggests they were central to divination practices. Chroniclers from the Spanish conquest period reported that Aztec leaders relied on mirror-based visions to interpret omens, predict invasions, and guide military movements. Modern optical experiments reveal that prolonged gazing into a uniform, dark surface can induce the Troxler effect, a neurological phenomenon in which the brain begins to fill in visual blanks with internally generated imagery. Subjects staring at a black, reflective disk under candlelight often report distorted faces, movement, or emerging shapes. The experience can feel external, even autonomous. The mind, deprived of visual stimuli, creates its own. When the Spanish clergy began dismantling indigenous religious systems, many ritual mirrors were confiscated or destroyed. Some were transported to Europe as curiosities. Others were catalogued without detailed explanation of their use. The spiritual framework surrounding them was dismissed as superstition. Surviving specimens are now displayed in museums as art objects, stripped of ritual context. What remains consistent across historical accounts is the role of the mirror as a channel, not symbolic, functional. The priest did not merely admire the surface. The priest entered it. Unlike the Mirror of John Dee, which was used in private sessions recorded in coded journals, the Aztec smoking mirror operated within a structured temple hierarchy. It was embedded into state religion and governance. The ruler consulted it before major decisions. If a polished volcanic disk, placed within a carefully engineered sensory environment, can alter perception reliably, then the mirror becomes less mystical and more mechanical. It becomes a device for inducing a specific state of consciousness. The deeper question is whether that state was interpreted as communication because of cultural belief, or because the experience itself felt undeniably external, and if two civilizations separated by an ocean both relied on black volcanic mirrors to reach beyond ordinary perception, the similarity becomes difficult to ignore. The Tibetan Dzi Stones. In the early 20th century, traders traveling through the Himalayan passes began reporting small cylindrical beads unlike any others in circulation. These beads were smooth, dark brown to black in color, etched with white circular or oval patterns that seemed embedded within the stone rather than painted on the surface. Known as Dzi Stones, they were worn around the neck or wrist, sometimes passed down for generations. Locals insisted the stones were not carved by human hands. They were said to have fallen from the sky or emerged from the earth after storms. Physically, most Dzi stones measure between 1 and 3 inches in length and are composed primarily of agate or chalcedony. The surface patterns, often resembling eyes, waves, or geometric bands, are created through a process that remains partially debated. Some researchers suggest a combination of heat treatment, alkaline etching, and mineral infusion. However, recreating the precise aging and coloration seen in older specimens has proven difficult. Microscopic analysis of certain high-grade examples reveals a layering of mineral penetration that suggests prolonged exposure to unknown environmental conditions. Unlike decorative beads from neighboring cultures, Dzi stones are almost always associated with spiritual use. Tibetan tradition holds that specific patterns carry protective properties. The so-called nine-eye Dzi is considered particularly powerful, believed to align the wearer with higher states of awareness and shield against unseen forces. These beliefs persist not only in folklore, but in structured Buddhist practice. What makes Dzi stones unusual is the absence of clear archaeological provenance. While they are commonly attributed to ancient Tibet or Central Asia, very few have been recovered in controlled excavation contexts. Most appear in private collections or are traded through informal channels. Their origin point remains uncertain. No ancient workshop has been definitively identified. In the mid-20th century, several specimens were sent to European laboratories for compositional testing. Reports indicated that while the base material was consistent with natural agate, the surface alterations could not be easily reproduced using traditional carving methods. Some scientists suggested that the white patterns resulted from selective chemical corrosion over extended time spans, though the initial catalyst remains unclear. The stones are rarely displayed in major museums. Their classification is often limited to ritual bead without deeper inquiry. Scholars tend to avoid claims regarding their spiritual properties, focusing instead on mineralogy. Yet collectors continue to assign extraordinary value to older examples, sometimes paying sums equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars. If Dzi stones were merely ornamental, their consistent association with protection rituals would be cultural coincidence. But the repetition of eye motifs across nearly all specimens raises questions about symbolic intent. Eyes are universal metaphors for perception, for seeing what is hidden. In a region where high-altitude isolation shaped spiritual traditions, these beads functioned as personal interfaces. They were not placed in temples or buried in foundations. They were worn directly against the body. If a small stone, etched with deliberate patterning, was believed to mediate unseen forces, then the mechanism may not lie in the mineral itself, but in the human response it triggers. And yet, without a clear origin, the Dzi stones remain suspended between geology and myth. If their patterns were engineered with specific intention, then someone, somewhere, understood how material form could influence perception in ways we have yet to fully decode. The Bath Curse Tablets. In 1979, during excavations beneath the Roman baths in the English city of Bath, archaeologists recovered thin sheets of lead no larger than a modern postcard. Many were tightly folded, some pierced with nails, others rolled into compact cylinders. At first glance, they appeared to be scraps of discarded metal, but once carefully unrolled, faint inscriptions became visible. These were curse tablets, known in Latin as defictiones, and they were not symbolic offerings. They were written petitions directed toward unseen powers. The Bath complex was built around a natural hot spring believed by the Romans to be sacred to the goddess Sulis Minerva. Visitors who suffered theft or injustice would inscribe the name of the offender onto a sheet of lead, along with a detailed request for divine punishment. Some tablets measure only 3 inches across, while others approach 8 inches in length. The inscriptions are specific. May the one who stole my cloak lose sleep and health. May their blood and eyes be taken. The tablets were then thrown into the sacred waters, disappearing beneath the surface. Lead was not chosen at random. It is dense, malleable, and resistant to corrosion in water. It also absorbs sound and electromagnetic radiation. In ancient ritual contexts, lead was often associated with the underworld. The tablets were not meant to be retrieved. They were sent downward into what worshippers believed was a liminal zone between worlds. Over 130 curse tablets have been recovered from the Bath spring alone. Many were written in imperfect Latin, suggesting ordinary citizens, not priests, composed them. The act was structured. The name of the victim, the stolen object, the plea for retribution, and sometimes the condition under which forgiveness could occur were all included. The formula is consistent across decades. What unsettles historians is the psychological clarity behind the ritual. The tablet was not symbolic release. It was a direct communication, sealed and delivered into an environment believed to transmit it. The spring's temperature averages 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and the mineral content is unusually high in sulfates and trace metals. The water emits a faint, persistent vibration detectable by sensitive instruments. When the tablets were first discovered, many were classified as minor artifacts of superstition. Some early finds were damaged during unrolling attempts. A portion of the collection disappeared from storage during wartime relocations. Only in recent decades have they been systematically translated. Unlike the oracle bones of China, which recorded inquiries to ancestors, these tablets were accusations. They were messages sent into a medium that functioned as a conduit. The sacred spring was not merely a backdrop, it was the delivery system. Modern researchers often reduce the tablets to expressions of frustration, but their precision and repetition suggest something more formalized. The writers believed the message would reach its target. If sacred water, combined with inscribed lead and intentional burial, was considered a reliable transmission method, then the Romans were not engaging in random superstition. They were following a protocol. And if dozens of independent individuals trusted that a sheet of engraved metal could cross a boundary between visible and invisible realms, then the ritual reflects a shared assumption that the boundary itself was permeable. The crystal skull of Mitla. In 1924, in the region of Oaxaca, Mexico, a crystal skull surfaced under circumstances that remain disputed. According to some accounts, it was discovered near the ruins of Mitla, an ancient Zapotec ceremonial center known for its geometric stone mosaics. The skull, carved from a single block of clear quartz, measured approximately 5 inches in height and weighed close to 10 pounds. It was anatomically detailed, with defined cheekbones, eye sockets, and a detachable jaw. What drew attention was not its appearance alone, but the precision of its construction. Quartz ranks 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, making it resistant to simple carving techniques. Early 20th century critics argued that such a skull could not have been shaped using pre-Columbian tools. Later microscopic analysis, however, revealed both rotary tool marks on some specimens and abrasion patterns on others. The debate intensified when certain skulls displayed no clear traces of modern machining, leaving their manufacturing methods uncertain. Optical studies conducted in the 1970s showed that when light passes through clear quartz skulls at specific angles, it refracts in unexpected ways. Beams entering through the base can illuminate the eye sockets, creating the illusion that the skull is glowing from within. In darkened rooms, candlelight projected through the structure produces shifting patterns that move across the interior. Quartz also possesses piezoelectric properties. When subjected to pressure, it generates small electrical charges. In industrial applications, quartz crystals are used in oscillators to regulate frequency. Proponents of the skull's ritual use suggest that priests may have exploited these optical and physical properties during ceremonies. A transparent skull placed above a flame in a dim temple chamber would appear animated. Combined with chanting or sensory deprivation, the effect could be disorienting, even overwhelming. Skeptics argue that many crystal skulls were likely carved in 19th century Europe and sold into antiquities markets. In fact, several museum specimens have been confirmed as modern creations. Yet not all skulls share identical provenance. A few remain difficult to conclusively date, particularly those held in private collections with limited access for testing. What distinguishes the Mitla skull in particular is its structural symmetry. Measurements indicate bilateral accuracy within fractions of an inch. The detachable jaw fits seamlessly, aligning with the upper cranium without visible hinge mechanisms. Such engineering suggests either advanced tooling or prolonged manual abrasion requiring years of labor. When examined under polarized light, internal stress lines within the quartz reveal no obvious fractures from aggressive shaping. This has led some researchers to speculate that the material may have been carefully selected for structural integrity before carving began. Official institutions often treat the skulls cautiously, emphasizing the likelihood of modern fabrication. However, access to certain specimens remains restricted, limiting independent analysis. Public fascination continues, fueled by claims that the skulls store information or act as consciousness amplifiers. If even one crystal skull were authentically pre-Columbian and crafted with the precision observed, it would challenge assumptions about lapidary capabilities in ancient Mesoamerica. More importantly, it would suggest deliberate use of a material known today for its resonance and signal stability. The skull, a universal symbol of mortality, carved from a crystal capable of refracting and conducting energy, becomes more than sculpture. It becomes a focal point. If ancient artisans understood how light and structure could interact within quartz, then the object may have been designed not just to be seen, but to alter the perception of those who looked into it. The Sumerian foundation figurines. In 1931, during excavations at the ancient Sumerian city of Lagash in southern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered a small copper figurine buried beneath the corner of a temple wall. The statue stood less than 10 inches tall, its hands clasped in prayer, its eyes wide and unblinking. It was not placed in a shrine. It was not displayed for worship. It had been deliberately sealed beneath layers of brick and stone, positioned directly under the structural axis of the building. Further excavations revealed dozens of similar figurines across Mesopotamian sites dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. Each was embedded into the foundation of temples, palaces, or city gates before construction was completed. Some were made of copper, others of stone or terracotta. Many bore inscriptions identifying the ruler who commissioned the building and invoking divine protection. What distinguishes these objects is their placement. They were never meant to be seen again. Once sealed beneath tons of mud brick and stone, they existed in darkness, under pressure, below the level of human activity. Their orientation was precise, often aligned with cardinal directions or positioned at load-bearing intersections. The inscriptions frequently included phrases translated as "to bind heaven and earth," or "to secure the dwelling of the god." The figurines were not decorative dedications. They were structural anchors within a cosmological framework. The Sumerians believed that temples were not merely buildings. They were meeting points between realms. The foundation figurine acted as an intermediary, linking the structure above to the divine domain below. Material analysis of several copper specimens reveals intentional alloy composition. Trace elements such as arsenic were included, increasing hardness and resistance to corrosion. Some figurines show evidence of ritual anointing before burial, with residue traces of oils and plant compounds detected in soil samples. When 20th century archaeologists began removing these objects for study, some were separated from their original context without detailed recording of orientation. Others were relocated to museum storage. The spiritual rationale behind their placement was often categorized as ceremonial symbolism, yet the repetition across centuries suggests systematic intent. Foundation deposits were not random acts of devotion. They followed consistent architectural protocols. Before walls rose, before roofs were placed, the figurine was embedded. Only then was the structure considered complete. If a building's stability was believed to depend not only on engineering, but on a symbolic or metaphysical anchor, then the figurine served as more than tribute. It functioned as a connector. Unlike the curse tablets thrown into water or the obsidian mirrors used in trance, these objects operated in stillness. They were placed at the boundary between earth and constructed space. They marked the seam where the human domain met what lay beneath. Modern construction acknowledges stress points, load distribution, and grounding systems. The Sumerians may have conceptualized grounding differently, not electrical, but cosmological. If temples were designed as thresholds, then something needed to hold that threshold in place. And if small metal figures buried beneath foundations were considered essential to maintaining balance between realms, then ancient architecture may have been less about shelter and more about alignment. The Tibetan Phurba dagger. In 1905, during a British expedition through the high plateaus of western Tibet, an officer documented a ritual object unlike any conventional weapon. It was approximately 12 inches long, forged from iron or bronze, with a three-sided blade tapering to a blunt tip. The handle was elaborately carved, often depicting wrathful deities, serpents, or multi-faced figures. The object was not sharpened for combat. It was never designed to cut flesh. It was a Phurba, a ritual dagger used in Vajrayana Buddhist ceremonies to pin spiritual forces to the earth. Unlike ornamental relics displayed in monasteries, the Phurba was an operational tool. During exorcism rites, it was driven downward into the ground or into ritual cakes made of barley flour. The act symbolized the immobilization of negative entities. The practitioner did not swing it like a blade. The practitioner anchored it vertically, point down, as if sealing a boundary. Many Phurbas were constructed with deliberate symmetry. The triangular blade represents stability across 3 dimensions. Some were cast from meteoric iron, according to metallurgical analysis of select specimens held in private collections. The inclusion of meteoritic material may not have been symbolic. Iron from meteorites carries higher nickel content and distinct crystalline structures known as Widmanstätten patterns, visible under polished conditions. Certain Phurbas were inscribed with seed syllables, mantra characters believed to carry vibrational potency. When struck lightly against stone floors, the dagger produced a resonant tone distinct from ordinary metal. The ritual context often included chanting, rhythmic breathing, and spatial orientation aligned with cardinal directions. During early 20th century museum acquisitions, Many Phurbas were catalogued simply as ritual knife. Their cosmological purpose was largely dismissed as folklore. Several high-ranking lamas insisted that the dagger's geometry was essential to its function. The three-edged blade was said to penetrate not physical matter, but energetic obstruction. Modern acoustical tests on preserved Phurbas reveal subtle resonance differences compared to ordinary bronze tools of similar size. Whether intentional or incidental remains debated. What is clear is that the object's form was standardized across centuries. The Phurba was not worn as jewelry. It was not displayed casually. It was activated within a ceremonial sequence. Its downward motion symbolized anchoring, sealing, stabilizing. If previous relics in this list functioned as interfaces for communication, the Phurba represents something different. It was not designed to open a channel. It was designed to close one. Across cultures, mirrors were used to look beyond. Stones were used to ask. Tablets were used to send. Figurines were used to bind foundations. And here, a dagger was used to fix unseen forces into place. If so many civilizations engineered objects to interact with invisible domains, then the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. These relics were not passive symbols. They were instruments within structured rituals. And if instruments were required, then those rituals were responding to something perceived as active. Whether that activity existed outside the human mind or emerged from it remains unresolved. But the consistency across continents and centuries suggests one unsettling possibility. Humanity has long behaved as if the visible world is not the only one. The Etruscan liver of Piacenza. In 1877, near the town of Gossalengo in northern Italy, a farmer plowing his field struck metal beneath the soil. What he uncovered was not a coin hoard or weapon, but a bronze object shaped unmistakably like a human liver. Measuring roughly 5 inches across and weighing just over 1 pound, the model was carefully cast with anatomical detail. Its surface was divided into dozens of small sections, each inscribed with abbreviated names of Etruscan deities. It was not art, it was a map. The object, now known as the liver of Piacenza, dates to the 2nd century BCE. It represents one of the clearest surviving tools of Etruscan haruspicy, the ritual practice of divining the will of the gods through the inspection of animal entrails. When a sacrificial animal was opened, priests examined the liver for irregularities. Bulges, discolorations, or marks were not interpreted randomly. They were compared against this standardized bronze template. Each zone corresponded to a specific divine authority. The model is divided into 40 distinct compartments, arranged in concentric order. The outer band contains the names of celestial gods associated with the sky. The inner sectors are linked to underworld or terrestrial forces. The liver itself was seen not merely as an organ, but as a reflection of the cosmos. The surface functioned as a coded interface between earthly events and divine structure. Physically, the bronze casting is precise. The raised lines separating each compartment are even and deliberate. Tool marks indicate skilled metalwork. The inscriptions, though abbreviated, follow consistent orthographic patterns. This was not an improvisational charm. It was a calibrated instrument used for instruction and reference. Roman historians later acknowledged that the Romans themselves adopted elements of Etruscan divination. High-ranking officials consulted haruspices before major state decisions. Entire military campaigns were delayed if liver readings were unfavorable. The bronze model may have served as a training guide for priests learning to interpret the signs correctly. When the liver of Piacenza was transferred to museum custody, it was classified as a ritual artifact of religious superstition. Its cosmological structure was documented, but its operational implications were minimized. No serious institutional research has attempted to evaluate how consistent readings may have been across different priests. What distinguishes this relic from others is its systematic design. The liver is not a random shape. It was standardized. Diviners were not improvising messages. They were interpreting anomalies against a fixed celestial grid. If the human body of a sacrificed animal was treated as a projection surface for divine signals, then the Etruscans believed that physical matter could encode information from beyond the visible world. The bronze liver was not symbolic. It was a decoding key. The implication is subtle but profound. The cosmos was believed to write through biology. And this small bronze organ, buried for over 2,000 years, suggests that ancient priests were not merely praying for answers. They believed the answers were already there, waiting to be read. The Norse Seiðr staff. In 1904, during the excavation of a richly furnished Viking grave at Birka in Sweden, archaeologists uncovered an iron staff placed carefully beside the remains of a woman buried with beads, brooches, and ritual objects. The staff measured nearly 3 feet in length, slightly curved at the tip, its shaft worn smooth from handling. It was not a spear, it was not a walking stick. Its shape did not match any known weapon from the period. Similar staffs have since been recovered from other Scandinavian graves, often associated with women identified as völur, practitioners of a ritual tradition known as Seiðr. Seiðr was described in Norse sagas as a form of prophetic magic. Those who practiced it were said to enter altered states, speak of future events, influence weather, and communicate with unseen forces. The staff was central to the ritual. Accounts suggest that the vulva would sit elevated on a platform, holding or planting the staff before her while chanting or receiving visions. The staff was not decorative, it was the axis of the rite. The physical construction of surviving staffs varies. Some are forged from iron with a knob or spiral finial at the top. Others contain bronze fittings or small rings attached near the head, possibly to create subtle sound during movement. Metallurgical analysis of certain examples indicates high carbon iron content, suggesting deliberate forging rather than casual manufacture. The curvature at the upper end appears intentional, not the result of bending damage. Unlike swords buried with warriors, these staffs were placed with individuals whose graves show no evidence of combat. Instead, the burial goods include amulets, animal bones, and occasionally small pouches containing plant residue. The association suggests ritual function. In at least one grave, the staff lay directly across the chest of the deceased, aligned with the body's vertical axis. Medieval texts portray Seiðr as both powerful and controversial. Some sagas describe it as dangerous or destabilizing. Practitioners were sometimes feared. The ritual required controlled chanting and possibly rhythmic sound patterns, accompanied by the physical presence of the staff planted upright in the ground. Archaeologists often categorize these objects simply as ceremonial rods. The broader cosmological context is minimized, yet their consistent appearance in female graves associated with ritual status indicates standardization. The staff was not a random accessory, it was part of a structured practice. If Seiðr involved entering altered states to access knowledge beyond ordinary perception, then the staff may have functioned as a grounding instrument. Its downward orientation during ritual mirrors other relics designed to anchor or channel unseen forces. The iron shaft placed into earth could symbolize connection between sky and ground. In a culture where cosmology included multiple realms such as Asgard, Midgard, and Hel, the idea of vertical alignment was central. The staff embodied that axis. It was a portable world tree reduced to metal. When Viking culture transitioned into Christian Scandinavia, references to Seiðr declined. The ritual was suppressed or reinterpreted. The staffs ceased appearing in graves. The practice faded from public memory. What remains are iron rods recovered from soil centuries later, stripped of voice and context. If the Seiðr staff was used as a physical mediator between visible and invisible realms, then its disappearance represents more than cultural change. It marks the closing of a technique once believed capable of reshaping perception itself. And if such tools were buried with their practitioners, sealed in earth for 1,000 years, perhaps they were not meant to be used again. Conclusion. These relics reveal a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Across continents and centuries, civilizations engineered physical objects for a singular purpose, to mediate between the visible world and something beyond it. Oracle bones were cracked under controlled heat. Stones were positioned above geological fractures. Mirrors were polished to optical depth. Quartz skulls were shaped with geometric precision. Bronze livers mapped the heavens onto flesh. Iron staffs were planted vertically as if stabilizing an unseen axis. This was not random belief. It was structured interaction. The repetition of method is striking. Specific materials were selected: obsidian, quartz, bronze, iron, lead. Objects were placed in liminal zones, beneath foundations, above chasms. Inside sacred water, in darkened chambers, buried in graves. The relic was never incidental. It was central to the ritual system. Without it, the procedure was incomplete. Over time, something changed. The rituals were categorized as superstition. The objects were removed from operational context and transferred into glass display cases. Their placement was separated from their function. Transcripts were fragmented. Excavation records were minimized. The technical precision behind their construction was acknowledged, yet their intended mechanism was quietly dismissed. If these artifacts were purely symbolic, the consistency of engineering would be unnecessary. If they were only psychological aids, the precision of placement and material selection would be excessive. Instead, they suggest that ancient cultures believed interaction required instruments. That perception could be altered through structure. That communication required calibration. The loss is not merely spiritual, it is methodological. When the relic is stripped of ritual, the protocol disappears. What remains is an object without instruction. The deeper implication is unsettling. Multiple civilizations behaved as though reality contained thresholds. They built devices to approach them. They believed access required preparation, alignment, and physical tools. Perhaps the question is not whether these relics truly connected to other realms. Perhaps the more disturbing question is why so many independent cultures were convinced that connection was possible in the first place. And if they were wrong, why did they all make the same mistake? If they were right, what exactly were they reaching toward?